Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alison Blais Palmer, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. And I have been asked to introduce Dr. Jennifer Clapp to you today, and it's my honor to do that. I remember hearing Jennifer speak when I was an undergraduate student and being really inspired by her enthusiasm and passion, and also by the breadth and depth of her expertise. At that time, she had just published what has been described as a seminal book on the political economy of the environment called Paths to a Green World with Peter Dauvergne. Since then, Jennifer has been appointed to a number of positions, including a chair here at CG. She is also a professor in Environment and Resource Studies at the University of Waterloo, as well as their director for the Center of Global Governance Research. In addition to that, if that wasn't enough, Jennifer is also co-editor of the MIT Press publication, Global Environmental Politics. She's an editorial board member for Global Governance, and she's also a contributing editor for the very well-read Alternatives Journal. It's appropriate that this talk be held here at CG, where the vision is described as adding to the intellectual landscape both here in Waterloo and beyond, and also attempting to push the boundaries and encourage us to reach towards more resilient communities and multilateral governance improvements across the world. So with that said, this is a perfect venue for Dr. Clapp's talk today that's titled Over 1 Billion Not Served, the Global Economic Crisis in Food Governance. In this talk, Jennifer's building on work that she's done in the past, where unlike the reflection that did not follow really the oil and food crisis of the early 1970s, she has taken stock and assessed the conditions for the consequences of the global food price crisis of 2007 and 2008 that resulted in widespread hunger and civil unrest across the developing world. And that talk is that theme is captured in her co-edited volume that I see in the back on the table, The Global Food Crisis, Governance Challenges and Opportunities. And what Jennifer is going to be talking to us about today is drawing our attention to the fact that this global food crisis was overshadowed by the financial crisis in the latter part of 2008. However, that doesn't take away from what's going on in the realm of food. We unfortunately now have passed the 1 billion mark as being the number of people who are undernourished in the world. And this distances us even more from the Millennium Development Goals of halving hunger by 2015 and getting that number down to 450 million people. So in this talk, Jennifer will examine the linkages between the global economic crisis, the rising hunger that's associated with that, and discuss the implications of various strategies for addressing the crisis and for food system sustainability. So it's my pleasure to introduce, and I hope you'll help me welcome Jennifer, and really look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thank you, Alison, for that very nice introduction. And as Alison said, the theme of the talk is Over 1 Billion Not Served, the Global Economic Crisis and Food Governance. And I am well aware that world hunger is a giant topic. It is a huge topic, and I hope to do it justice in the 45 minutes or so that I have to deliver this lecture. And it will be a challenge to cover everything, but that is in fact the point of the talk that I want to give today, is that global hunger is complex, it is wide-ranging, and that if we want to address it adequately, we need a range of measures to cover it. Now, ending world hunger is, I want to put this out on the table first, ending world hunger is not just a matter of increasing production of food in the world. If that was the problem, we wouldn't have hunger in the world today. Hunger is a product not just of how much food is available in society, but also people's access to it, whether people have the purchasing power to acquire food in order to eat. And people's access to food, their purchasing power, is very much tied to broader economic relationships in the global economy. And this is an important point. And this point, it's not a point that I made up myself. In fact, Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen taught us this very important point. Way back in the early 1980s, when he published a seminal work on understanding crisis and famine, and demonstrated that food availability was not the cause of hunger, it was the lack of access. And this is an important lesson that we need to learn. And I want to stress in the talk today that this is, when we're looking at governance and how to address hunger, we need to keep this important lesson in mind. And the global food crisis of 2008, as Alison mentioned, when food prices rose very quickly, and civil unrest erupted, was a stark reminder of this very point. The time at which food prices were rising and hunger was increasing, we actually were experiencing record production of food in the world. And as you can see, the food price index from the FAO shows just how rapidly and sharply food prices rose and how quickly they fell again. But the impact was enormous in terms of affecting people's ability to access food. Now, even though food prices fell on international markets shortly following the financial meltdown in the fall of 2008, which demonstrated just how fragile food prices and hunger were, hunger actually got worse. This is the part that's been puzzling a lot of people. If prices on international food markets went down following the financial crash, why are people still hungry? The situation has only gotten worse, and as Alison pointed out, hunger is actually on the rise. We've now, as I said, passed the 1 billion mark in terms of the number of people who go to bed hungry every night. And that proportion of people in the world who are going hungry is also on the rise. We had, since the 1970s, seen a bit of a decline in the proportion of the world's population experiencing hunger, and that's now been reversed. So we're in a pretty dire situation. So how do we make sense of all of this? I want to argue that there are both short-term and long-term considerations that we have to take into account in understanding the global food situation. These factors, I'm going to go through them in the talk today, but I want to stress that it's not just as simple as pointing them out and then asking global institutions to take care of the problem. If only it were that easy. It's a very, very difficult situation, and in particular because there are flashpoints of disagreement along the way. Not everybody agrees in terms of what is causing this crisis, and not everybody agrees on the best way forward. So the field is fraught with disagreement. So my main aim today is to map out the lay of the land on the global food situation and the main governance responses that we've seen thus far. And there's 3 key points that I want to make. The first is that, as I said already, that we have some serious short-term challenges that need to be addressed. And these have a lot to do with food price volatility. In other words, the rapid ups and downs of food prices. What's interesting here is that we actually have some agreement on the cause of the problems, what is causing food price volatility, but there's a lack of agreement on how best to address it. In terms of long-term challenges, and here we're talking about vulnerability, the extent to which developing countries in particular are vulnerable to changes in global food prices, we see both the causes and the governance solutions hotly debated. But what's interesting here is that the governance responses we've seen at the international level have actually taken one side over the other. And this has raised some concern, and particularly on those who are taking the argument that hasn't been adopted. And finally, I want to conclude by talking about the ways in which the hungry 1 billion might be better served, by pointing out what initiatives could be taken in terms of global governance to improve the situation. Okay, I want to start with the short-term challenges. And there are a number of short-term challenges, in other words, immediate challenges that need to be addressed. And the first that I want to talk about is the linkage between financial speculation and food price volatility. Now, although there was wide debate in 2008 over why food prices were rising so quickly, And at the time, there was a lot of discussion that it was a supply and demand situation. In hindsight, several years later, and in fact, I gave a talk here at CG in May of 2008 where I basically made the argument that it was not a supply and demand issue. It actually had a lot to do with financial speculation. Now, what we're seeing in hindsight is a lot of analysts are coming around to this same conclusion, that financial speculation, in fact, had created a bit of a food price bubble in early 2008, which was causing food prices to rise so rapidly. So how did this happen? What is the linkage? It actually has a lot to do with what was going on in the financial world at the time. And if you remember way back to the summer of 2007, this is when there was the housing and mortgage crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis, and at this time investors were fleeing some investments and moving into others. And at the time, commodity prices were actually performing well compared to the mortgage and securities markets, and so investors were moving their money into agricultural commodity investments. Now, these agricultural commodity investments they're called futures contracts, and they're a kind of derivative. They're a financial product that banks sell to investors that they can basically make a bet. They're betting on whether food prices will be going up. So if you invest in an agricultural commodity future contract and the price of food goes up, you're going to get a higher return. And so what we saw at the time is when the financial markets were experiencing a lot of instability, people started to move their investments into commodity funds, of which agricultural commodities are a big part. And these are called commodity index funds in particular. And commodity index funds bundle together energy futures contracts, food futures contracts, and other minerals into a single financial product, and they're sold by large banks, AIG, Goldman Sachs, etc. So as investors started to move in this period, quite remarkably, between 2005 and 2008, investment in these funds went from 13 billion to over 200 billion. That's an enormous amount. This was a huge movement, and this was fueled in large part by financial deregulation that had occurred over the previous decade. What we saw in the 1990s and in the early 2000s was that the Commodity Future Trade Oversight Organization, the CFTC in the US, actually started to relax the limits that had previously been placed on investing in agricultural commodity future contracts. And I know that it's a bunch of, maybe a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but basically in the US there have been long-standing rules that say you can't invest huge amounts in agricultural commodity futures contracts simply as a speculative initiative because it will affect food prices. But what had happened in this period is that banks had begged the regulatory oversight agency to relax those limits, and they basically did relax them. So what we saw was big amounts of money from hedge funds, pension funds, etc., moving into commodity index funds, and this pushed up food prices. And it's not hard to see how that would push up food prices. As everyone's going in and buying futures contracts, then there's actually limited supply of these contracts and a great deal of demand. Food prices, as a result, went up. So what we saw then was a very volatile situation where food prices rose very, very rapidly. And just to give an example of how extreme this was, in the wheat sector, the US Senate had commissioned a report last summer to look into the question of excessive speculation in the wheat market, and they actually discovered that at one point in 2008, just 6 traders, these are 6 traders on the market who are trading futures contracts, they held 60% of all the wheat futures contracts that were attributed to commodity index funds. This was an enormous amount of power in the hands of just 6 traders on the market. So, but that's my key point here, is that volatility has a lot to do with these broader economic relationships, such as financial instability that was going on in the world. So this volatility is important, and we need to keep it in mind. Now, a second key short-term challenge has to do with the fallout from the financial crisis that occurred after the food price bubble went up in early 2008. As you recall, the banking meltdown, big crisis happened in fall 2008. And at that time, what's interesting is food prices actually fell back quite significantly as the economic crisis began to spread. But hunger actually got worse in the world's poorest countries. Now, why did it get worse? A number of factors were factor at play here. With a financial meltdown, credit markets got very, very tight. It was very difficult for developing countries to access funds on credit markets to actually purchase food. And this is a problem because many developing countries, as I'll talk about in a minute, are very dependent on food imports for a huge proportion of their caloric intake. And so what we saw then is as credit became more difficult to access, developing countries couldn't afford to purchase that food, and then prices actually stayed high in developing countries even though they fell in the West. So here in Waterloo, we probably didn't notice very much at all in terms of our food bill at this time because food prices came back down, but in developing countries they stayed high, and this contributed to a continuation of hunger. In addition, at the same time, many developing countries in the face of the economic crisis had to devalue their currencies in order to maintain competitiveness on international markets for the other goods that they export, and this only exacerbated the situation and made food prices stay high domestically for them. So the result was that even though food prices on international markets, where food is traded internationally, went down, within developing countries food prices stayed historically high, and this had a huge impact on hunger. And the broader economic crisis resulting in unemployment, reduced remittances, etc., only made the situation worse. The UN estimated that during the economic crisis, especially in 2009, some 60 to 90 million more people were pushed into the category of poor. And when you think of the world's poorest people spend 50 to 80% of their income on food, being pushed into the category of poor also pushes you into the category of hungry. And so this is what we saw. And as you can see here on this graphic, that the overall impact of the financial crisis on food security across the developing world was enormous. Overall, some 12% more people were pushed into the category of food insecure, some regions being affected more than others. Latin America hit particularly hard. Okay, the third short-term challenge that I want to talk about is the difficulty in meeting food aid needs. Because if you think about what was going on, food prices rising quickly, hunger being continuing in developing countries, food aid is one of the key international responses to address these immediate crises of hunger. And it was a big challenge because usually organizations like the World Food Program are addressing hunger crises that are specific locations, a location that might be affected by conflict, a location that might be affected by drought, or some other sort of emergency, such as the earthquake in Haiti. But in this situation, the World Food Program was trying to just maintain its food aid programs across the entire developing world in a context in which food prices were going up. This meant that the World Food Program, as an aid providing agency, all of a sudden its purchasing power was also diminished by rising food prices. It had a serious crisis. In mid-2008, the World Food Program put out an international plea for an additional $700 million to meet its own food aid budget. And the only country that really stepped up to the plate at this point was Saudi Arabia with a huge, enormous $500 million donation. But since that time, in 2009 in particular, the World Food Program was in a dire situation. It actually put out plea after plea, arguing that it was not going to be able to meet its estimated budget. And in fact, it ended up cutting a lot of its food aid programs. At the time when hunger was at its worst, they were actually scaling back the amount of food they were able to hand out simply because they were unable to acquire enough food. And donors, in the situation of economic crisis, they actually were giving less, because this is a typical pattern we see. Rich countries in a global recession, they give less aid. So it was a situation where hunger was getting worse, but aid was going down, and it put the World Food Program in a very, very precarious situation. And it's particularly troubling because food aid in general tends to be what is called counter-cyclical with respect to prices. And that means, what that basically means is that when food prices go up, the amount of food aid available goes down. And that's exactly the time when you need more food aid. When food prices go down, food aid goes up, but you don't need it that much. And you can see, if you look at the graphic here that I've included for food aid deliveries between 1970 and 2008, you'll see 2007 and 2008 are quite low years in comparison historically to the amount of food aid that's been given. This is a big product of the fact that food prices were very high, whereas in earlier decades, food aid was much higher when food prices were lower. Okay, so those are some pretty serious short-term challenges. What have been the government's responses that we've seen in reaction to these challenges, and what more needs to be done? And I'll talk a bit about this. In particular, the most action in terms of these short-term challenges has been with respect to financial speculation, and there's some new developments on the horizon with respect to food aid. I just want to talk about both of these briefly. First, with respect to financial speculation, although there is now, I would say, a widespread acknowledgement of the role of financial speculation in fueling food price volatility, which affects people's access, there's still a widespread debate about what to do about it. It's not clear that there's one single solution that everyone agrees on with respect to ending food price volatility. Now, at the time when the food crisis erupted, and since, we've seen a lot of reports from the organizations such as the World Bank, the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the Group of 8, the Group of 20, the UN, which established a high-level task force on food security. They all mentioned this issue of food price speculation, financial speculation affecting food price volatility, but none of them actually recommend any particular action to address it, which is quite remarkable. There seems to be a bit of a complacency with respect to financial speculation that these markets are ungovernable, which is interesting because we are actually in the midst of a big discussion globally in the G20, as well as what's going on in the US right now with respect to financial regulation. And a lot of that discussion is about regulating derivatives, which is exactly what trade and agricultural commodity future contracts are. They're actually derivatives. Yet there's very little mention and discussion of regulating agricultural commodity derivative trade in particular. I just want to give an example of the World Bank's interpretation of what's going on. They acknowledge the food price volatility. The prices are going up and down quite rapidly and sharply, but they argue that it's just a new part of the food landscape. This is just the way it is. Their response to the situation is not regulation, it's actually to sell poor farmers in developing countries insurance against the risk of prices changing. The World Bank is also now offering developing countries that the World Bank, will engage in weather derivatives markets, so in other words, using more derivatives markets to basically bet on whether weather will be good or bad, and try to help developing countries by making a payoff to developing countries in situations where the weather is bad. In other words, to pay them off in the case of drought. It's a bit of a weird response in some ways to the situation. Instead of saying, let's put a clamp down on food price, or rather on food speculation, it's saying, let's use those speculative markets and play them to our advantage. It's, in a sense, using the same tools to address the problem. Now, some people have a real problem with this approach, obviously, you might guess. There are a lot of critics now who are arguing that we need to address this through stricter regulation of financial markets. Because if we think about it, as I said already, there have been limits in the past on how much investors could invest in agricultural commodity futures contracts because it seemed to have, affected the price of something that's a basic need. Now critics are calling for some sort of global agreement to actually get countries around the world to clamp down on their commodity futures markets and to put these limits back in place at a global level. Some NGOs are calling for this and really making the case quite strongly. And it's interesting that this debate is even going on within the United States. The Agriculture Committee of the Senate and the House have been debating this issue of agricultural derivatives quite closely, more so than any other country in the world, which is interesting because if you get the US on side, usually you can then get some kind of global agreement to follow. But we aren't there quite yet. If you've been following the financial reform debates, they're actually discussing this as we speak in the Senate today. They're expecting that bill to come onto the Senate floor sometime in the next couple of days. Whether it has a strong language with regard to agricultural commodity futures trade remains to be seen. I'll be watching the news closely. But I just thought you might find it interesting that they did include in the bill that they're going to ban all derivatives trade on box office office movie derivatives, which is the latest thing that someone wanted to invent, betting on how movies do in the box office. So if the Senate and the House in the US can come to agreement that we should ban movie derivatives, you would think they might have some initiative to ban or at least severely regulate commodity futures derivatives. We'll see. We'll find out. Okay, now with respect to food aid, this is another interesting area in international governance that there's an opportunity at this time. There's an opportunity because there's an agreement out there called the Food Aid Convention, and I would guess that most people sitting in this audience probably have never heard of that convention before. It's a rather obscure convention, dates back to 1967, and the Food Aid Convention is a donor agreement, an agreement amongst the rich countries that give food aid, that they have to give a certain amount every year in order to maintain at least a minimum level of support for developing countries. The idea of this agreement is that it provides a backstop if there is a crisis. There will at least be a minimum amount of aid. But there's a lot of problems with this convention. There's a lot of problems in the sense that it doesn't do a lot to counteract the counter-cyclical problem with food aid with respect to prices. Because if donors miss their target and they don't give enough aid in one year, they can just make it up the next year without any penalty. And this only makes the situation of the counter-cyclical problem of food aid with food prices actually worse. So what's interesting is that this convention is actually up for renegotiation at this time. It actually expired back in 2004, and they've been giving it a one-year renewal all of these years since then. But they've actually decided now that this is the time that we actually need to do something about it because of the pressing food situation. What's really interesting here is that Canada is actually now taking up the chairship of this convention starting in June. So there's a real opportunity for Canada to take a leadership role in actually renegotiating this convention to make it more effective. And so there's a lot of activity within Canada and internationally to press our government to do something to make this treaty more effective. Now, there's a lot of problems with this treaty, and I don't have time to go into them all. But whether all of these problems are solved, again, that remains to be seen. It's unlikely that we'll see huge changes, I would guess, simply because of the financial implications for donors to radically change their policies. But I wouldn't close at the door to the fact that we may actually see some small improvements with respect to the delivery of food aid. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the short-term challenges, but that's only part of the picture. The food price situation and the hunger situation also has to do with the long-term issues as well, issues of productivity and issues that explain the vulnerability of developing countries to changes, to these short-term changes. And it's these underlying long-term changes where we've actually seen more action, I would say, with respect to reforming international governance to address the situation. Now, the first long-term challenge I want to talk about is the increased dependence in developing countries on imported food to meet their caloric needs. As you can see from the graphic I'm shown here, this situation has actually gotten worse in recent decades. In other words, developing countries are importing a higher and higher percentage of their food needs every year. So they're simply not producing enough food to be self-sufficient. Now, was it always like this? Was this always the situation that developing countries were buying food from abroad? The answer is no. If we look historically, if we look way back, we see with respect to the least developed countries, their agricultural trade balance actually used to be positive, whereas now it's negative. So in other words, the developing countries, the poorest developing countries, used to be net exporters of agricultural products. They are now net importers of agricultural products. And this feeds into a second key challenge that I want to talk about, which is the lagging productivity of agriculture in the world's poorest countries. As we see in the graphic here, developing countries actually are seeing a less rapid increase in terms of their yield increases over time, and it's actually, this lagging is actually most pronounced in the world's poorest countries, such as in sub-Saharan Africa. So whereas East Asian countries might be seeing higher productivity gains, it's actually been quite stagnant in developing countries. And this is related, and many have said, to the fact that aid, international assistance for agriculture, has actually been falling as a percentage of overseas development assistance quite remarkably over the past 30 years. So back in 1979, 1980, 20% of overseas development assistance was going to agricultural aid, whereas by 2007 it was a mere 5%. That's a pretty precipitous drop. Now this is where things get interesting. There's widespread agreement that there's this productivity lag that exists. There's widespread agreement that developing countries have become more dependent on imported food to meet their food needs, but there's a huge disagreement on why this situation has emerged. And if you think, obviously what your interpretation is of why the situation emerged deeply affects what you think will have to be done about it. So this is the area where I would say we're actually seeing a lot of disagreement in terms of these explaining these trends. Now, I want to talk about these two main explanations that have been put forward for why we've seen this deepening vulnerability of developing countries in terms of food import dependence and lagging productivity. On the one hand, we've got some arguing, some such as the World Bank in particular, arguing that it's poor technology and poor infrastructure that explains weak production and rising dependence on imports in developing countries. The World Bank argues, for example, that what we're seeing is the least gains in productivity in sub-Saharan Africa are a direct product of the fact that those countries in sub-Saharan Africa did not adopt green revolution technologies in the 1970s and 80s, as did countries in East Asia. So, in other words, they're pointing to the failure to adopt the latest agricultural technologies. This is why these countries are producing less. They also say that it has a lot to do with weak infrastructure. Poor roads and other kinds of marketing infrastructure are dampening farmer incentives to actually improve their production. So by pointing to the lack of infrastructure and to the failure to adopt modern technologies, the World Bank is largely portraying the problem of productivity decline in developing countries as actually a domestic problem. It has to do with decisions that were made within developing countries. This is the kind of argument that they've made. But it's only one argument, and others disagree with this profoundly. Rather than seeing the productivity problems in developing countries as being a product of domestic decisions, others argue that it actually is very much linked to the global economy. And in fact, it is a product of the very deeply unfair trade rules that we've seen develop in the global agricultural trade system. Now, this view has been put forward by a lot of critics of the bank, including those who were involved in the writing of a key report that came out in 2008, which is called the ISTAD report. It's the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development. And I'll talk about that more in a minute, but just to say that that report was actually the product of 400 scientists working to understand what is going on in the agriculture system and why we're seeing hunger spreading so widely. This was 400 scientists over a period of 4 years studying this issue very deeply. And one of the key arguments that they've made in this report, which is a huge, giant, many page report, is about the agricultural trade system and the way in which it's been deeply unfair to developing countries. Now, when we look at it, agricultural trade is actually the most distorted sector in the global economy. It is the most distorted, even though it's a relatively small share of global trade. But it's important. What we've seen is, in particular, are enormous agricultural subsidies paid to farmers in the rich countries of the OECD. And these subsidies are actually now over $375 billion a year. That's more than $1 billion a day being paid to farmers in the rich industrialized countries. And what is the impact of this? Well, if you think about it, the impact of those subsidies going to farmers to produce more food has actually produced a mountain of cheap food in the industrialized countries, which has then been exported to developing countries. Now, when cheap food is flooding global markets, and this has happened over a period of 30 years, it's actually depressed international prices for food over a very long period of time, which harmed incentives for poor farmers in developing countries to produce their own food. So rather than saying it's a domestic problem that has to do with technology or that has to do with infrastructure, this argument is saying actually it's the global trade system and the rich countries' own agricultural policies which are negatively impacting developing countries and poor world farmers. this is a huge problem. When we add to the problem of the over-subsidization of agriculture in the rich countries, and you look at the agricultural trade agreement that enshrines this practice, it's actually endorsed in the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Agriculture, which was agreed in 1994. The rich countries also restrict access of the poor countries' exports to their own markets, and they press developing countries to open their markets further to accept their cheap goods. And this has been a huge source of contention in the WTO trade talks for years. A new round of trade talks was launched in 2001 called the Doha Round, and this round was specifically called the development round because agriculture was supposed to be at the center, and they were supposed to fix the problems of this deeply unequal system. However, these talks have been dragging on since 2001 with very little progress, and developing country farmers are deeply aware of this situation. They're very skeptical now of global trade in agriculture because they see it hurting their own productivity. What's interesting, though, is that international agencies have continued to give advice, international agencies meaning largely the World Bank, have continued to give advice to developing countries to import these cheap foods from abroad and to export their specific niche market products because that, they argued, is part of their own comparative advantage and they would benefit from trade. But the distortions in this sector, the critics say, are the key source of the problem. It's not a domestic problem, why farmers aren't producing as much in developing countries. It's an international trade problem, and that this is something that needs to be rectified. And it can't easily be done overnight, and that's a key point as well. This vulnerability of developing countries due to the trade system has actually developed over a period of 30 to 40 years, and it's created a deep vulnerability. So, it almost became normal that food prices were so low for so long, and developing countries were dependent on food imports for so long. But so long as food prices were low, nobody really noticed. It was only when the crisis happened and food prices rose quickly because of the volatility that I've already talked about that people started to realize, oh my goodness, we have a very vulnerable situation here. And even just a few weeks ago, it's interesting, Bill Clinton was testifying in the US Congress about a bill which has come forward for aid for Haiti in the wake of the earthquake. And he actually admitted that the agricultural policies, the trade policies that he pursued as president were wrong. He actually says, I'm sorry I did this. This was terrible. It helped farmers in Arkansas, but it hurt Haiti. And it's amazing for a former president to make that huge admission of the situation. So it's not just radical critics who are making this argument. It's a lot of people who are pointing the finger at these trade imbalances. Okay, so we've got a huge disagreement then on what is causing these long-term vulnerability problems. What have been the governance challenges so far, or rather the governance responses? And what's interesting here is that because we have two very different interpretations of the cause of the crisis, we also have two very different interpretations of what governance responses should be forthcoming. So I want to explain these, and I want to do it in the context of two organizations or reports that I've already mentioned, which is the World Bank on the one hand and the ISTAD on the other. Now, as I said, these two organizations have widely different viewpoints, not just on the cause of the crisis, but also what we need to do. And they're mapped out in their key reports that both, interestingly, came out in 2008, one being the World Bank's World Development Report, and the other being the ISTAD Global Summary, which both came out in the height of the food crisis and map out very different arguments for where we need to go to address the situation. So first I want to talk about the World Bank, and perhaps not surprising given that they see that it's a technology and infrastructure problem that is causing the productivity decline in developing countries. They argue that the way forward then is that we need to increase food production in developing countries using new modern agricultural technologies. In particular, they argue that with a growing global population and with a threat of climate change on the horizon, which will affect food productivity, that genetically modified modified organisms, or agricultural biotechnology, is the only way forward for the world's poorest countries if they want to overcome this productivity problem. They are a huge supporter of moving in the direction of agricultural biotechnology and go to great lengths to argue that these new varieties, which are genetically modified, can provide drought resistance, pest resistance, and other sort of yield increasing properties that will be necessary in this climate challenged world. They also make a key argument that we need further trade liberalization, and this is quite interesting. Even though critics have argued that trade liberalization has been the problem to start with, they actually argue that more liberalization is good for developing countries, and in fact it's more important that developing countries open their markets to goods from Western countries than it is for Western countries to reduce their subsidies. They actually make an economic argument for this particular point, which is something I want to look more into, where their numbers came from. But they basically say that, that these $375 billion in subsidies every year that rich countries pay their farmers don't really matter. It's that developing countries need to open their markets further. They also stress that developing countries need to engage in global markets more fully by developing niche products that they can then sell into global food supply chains. In other words, selling pineapples and bananas and green peppers and green beans into global supermarket chains as a way in which they can then integrate into the global economy more fully and increase their incomes to reduce poverty. So that's the World Bank's vision, and they're very clear. If you read the report, though it's several hundred pages, it's very clear that this is what they would like to see happen as a key governance response to these long-term challenges. This is very different from the ISTAD report. The ISTAD and other critics have made strong arguments against the arguments of the World Bank in particular, and they've also offered alternative solutions. In terms of the critiques, they point out the limits and costs of agricultural biotechnology. I mean, to start with, there are all kinds of risks associated with the adoption of agricultural biotechnology, and that gets us into debates around science, but there are questions out there about safety for human consumption, about safety ecologically, whether we're going to see super weeds emerge, etc. But there's also questions of whether these crops are even ready. The World Bank has been pressing for adoption of agricultural biotech in the poorest developing countries, but in fact, even those in the agricultural biotech industry admit they don't have the crops ready to be available to poor country farmers to use, say, next year, or not even the year after that. They're saying that the development of these drought-resistant, pest-resistant varieties that are suitable for use in African soils are about 10 years out. So, in a way, it's not even quite ready yet. There's also concern about intellectual property right considerations, because a lot of the current agricultural biotechnology that we have available is actually controlled by corporations, and this raises questions about equity, etc., if we're asking poor country farmers to buy new seeds and then obviously pay for them, and this is going to have huge equity considerations. So as an alternative, those who put together this important report, they actually say that if we look closely at the research on other methods, such as agroecological methods of producing food, that we could see equal or even better results without any of the risks, and which would be much more equitable in terms of distribution. And this is what they put forward as a solution, rather than just focusing solely on ag biotech as the one silver bullet. They say we need a variety of methods. They don't actually rule out ag biotech as potentially one method of agricultural production, but it needs to be rounded out, they argue, with these agroecological methods, which are much less risky. And then regarding trade, the ISTAD also has some very in-depth chapters which deal with the global trade situation. They're very critical of the bank's push for further liberalization, which they see as actually a death sentence for developing countries. They say that pushing for more liberalization only makes developing countries more vulnerable on global markets and more exposed to price changes in terms of food prices. And they also point out that the advice the World Bank gives to engage more in agricultural food supply chains, particularly supermarkets, which are now increasingly huge global corporations, is actually reducing the voice of developing country farmers in the global economy. So they put forward an alternative which is focused on development of local food systems, which is less reliant on trade, but more resilient when we do see big changes in the global economy, such as occurred in 2008. Many call this a concept food sovereignty. It basically is saying that we should be giving countries and local communities the right to choose when they do and do not engage in international trade. It should not be a requirement, it should be a choice. And this is the kind of argument that they put forward. So obviously two very different views on this, not just the causes of this long-term challenge, but also the solutions moving forward. It's a field that is fraught with debate. But what's interesting to me as a sort of student of global governance, looking at, well, what has the global community done to address this situation? It's interesting that even though this long-term challenge is fraught with enormous debate, this is the one area on which we've seen some action in terms of a global initiative to address the situation. And what we saw was last year, in the summer of 2009, at the Lalkila G8 summit, it was agreed that there would be a new trust fund for long-term agricultural development, which it incorporated $20 billion that the donors put forward. This was endorsed by the G20 in Pittsburgh in 2009, and this brought together what they're calling the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, which has a horrible acronym. They needed to have thought more carefully about this before they decided on that title, because you can't even pronounce it. But what's interesting about this new trust fund and this new global partnership is they decided to house it in the World Bank. So you can guess what kind of approach this global governance initiative is taking. So think about it. It's a huge amount of money, $20 billion. It's the only thing the global community has actually accomplished in terms of addressing the food situation, and it's almost entirely geared towards investment in new technology for agricultural productivity. This is interesting. It's interesting not just because they've taken a side and joined the side of the World Bank and said this is where it goes. It was also happening at the very same time that other organizations in the United Nations, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, were actually developing their own long-term strategy for what needs to be done. And that long-term strategy was coming out of a UN high-level task force, which developed a comprehensive framework on agriculture, and the World Committee on Food Security, which was actually just revitalized in the fall of 2009 to include more civil society voices and to take a more prominent role in food governance. So what happened was the UN was positioning itself to take the lead on this issue, and the powerful countries, the G8 and the G20, decided to put all their money somewhere else. So they sidestepped the UN organization completely by putting it in the World Bank. And this has caused a lot of consternation amongst those who are on the other side of this issue. And it was these tensions were very visible at the World Food Summit in Rome in 2009, just a few months ago. It was remarkable, the extent to which these divisions were taking place. So this is what's happened in terms of investment, and just to stress again, what's interesting, the G8 and the G20 have also called for a swift conclusion to the Doha round, but I just want to stress that this is no guarantee that we'll actually see a better trade deal. And we've seen this go on, these talks go on since 2001, and the rich countries have been very reluctant to give up their subsidies. And whether we're going to get there remains to be seen. Some developing countries are actually now calling for an abandonment of the round completely. So that will be interesting to see what happens. Okay, Alison has given me the signal that I have to conclude, so I am at my last slides, I promise. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is asking the question, how can the hungry 1 billion in the world be better served? This is something that the international community needs to address, and what's interesting is that, to me, is that the G8 and the G20, the only organizations out there at the international level with the money and the power to set the agenda, have thus far only taken a one-track solution. They put all their eggs in one basket. They put it in the technology basket. They want to see greater productivity, and they want to see it done with agricultural biotechnology. And this is interesting because we've tried this strategy before. The Green Revolution, going back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, was a similar project. It was all about new technology to increase production to address hunger. In other words, it was addressing hunger with a technological solution. We've tried that before, and we did not eliminate world hunger. World hunger has been with us, it has continued to be with us, and we need to take a broader strategy. So that's a key argument that I want to make today in concluding, is that we need a multiple-pronged approach, going beyond just investment in technology. Because to come back to a point I made at the beginning of the talk, hunger is about far more than just productivity. So if we're going to address it, we have to make a much broader attempt than just adopting new technologies. Because increased productivity will not guarantee access to food. So if we want to do something, and if we want the organizations such as the G8 and the G20 to do something meaningfully at the international level to improve access, instead of just productivity, and I don't want to say productivity is not important. We do need to see more productivity, especially in developing countries, but we need to improve access as well. There are key things the G8 and the G20 could do to make this happen. And this is a perfect opportunity for Canada to push these arguments because Canada is hosting the G8 and the G20 this June. So what could it do? Well, it could incorporate food security considerations more fully into its financial reform discussions. Most of the G20's activity is actually about financial reform. They're discussing the whole need to have a better regulation in order to avoid financial meltdown in the future. If you plow through their documents and their statements, they never mention food security once in any of their discussions on the financial crisis. It's remarkable. They could connect those dots and make it clear that they mean limits to agricultural commodity derivative trade. They could do this at the international level. This is something they could do. Secondly, they could endorse a strong reform of the Food Aid Convention. On the track we're on now, I think we're probably going to see a mediocre kind of reform of the Food Aid Convention. It could be much stronger. And an organization like the G8, the G20, which includes most of the donors to that convention, if they endorsed a strong reform, we might see more action. The G8 and the G20 could actually live up to their commitment to make a more fair and balanced trade round. Even though a lot of critics are very skeptical of trade altogether, the point remains that we have a very unbalanced system today, and if we don't address it, it's going to continue. So something needs to be done, and to act swiftly, rather than to keep repeating over and over again that we need a swift conclusion to the Doha round, we actually need to see it backed up by some real commitment to reduce agricultural subsidies in the rich countries. And finally, I think the G8 and G20 could broaden its horizon with respect to the productivity issue. Rather than focusing narrowly on biotechnology, which is very clear from their statement, I think they mentioned the word access once and the word technology about 10 times. What they need to do is take a broader approach. Even if they want to continue to push a technological solution, they need to supplement it with a broader approach that includes agroecological methods. I think that it's almost counterproductive for them to ignore these alternative agricultural methods altogether, when science shows us there actually is a lot of productivity increase that can be had from this broader approach. So just in conclusion, I just want to say that, and hopefully it's clear, after I've talked for too long now, that addressing global hunger is a wide-ranging and very complex topic. I hope I haven't skimmed over the issues too much, but I'm sure I've done to some extent. But the key point I want to stress is that hunger is not a technological problem. It's a political problem, and it's an economic problem. We need both productivity and improved access if we are going to achieve a world without hunger. Thank you.
That was amazing. That was just such an unbelievably succinct and wonderful overview of an incredibly complex set of circumstances. We're very lucky to have Jennifer here to talk to us today about this really pressing matter for humankind. And I think now we have probably about 5 minutes for questions. So we have a microphone here in the middle. If people would like to just go to the mic, line up and ask your questions to Jennifer, I'll hand the mic back to her, and then we'll wrap up quickly after that, okay? Thank you again, Jennifer. That was just phenomenal.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you.
Hello, Jennifer. Agatha Ankiewicz from CG. Since hunger and food security, as you said, are political problems rather than productivity problems, what do you think are the chances for the G20 to actually reach a decision? We've seen in international cooperation in the past that decisions are much more likely to be made in unforeseen circumstances, in like what we've seen with the economic crisis, which is now slowly being subdued, and other issues are taking the forefront. What do you think are the chances that once the economic crisis is sort of bygones, they will actually make a decision on anything?
Thank you, Agatha. That's a really good question. I do frequently wonder, as we seem to be crawling out of the global economic recession, at least in the West, whether we've missed the opportunity for meaningful reform, both on food and on finance. And I think that's one of the key areas that we need to address, is to reach that kind of agreement. The one hope I have, though, is that if the bill that passes, and the Democrats say they're going to get a bill, we'll find out. The Republicans are threatening the filibuster of the financial reform bill. But if it passes, and if it includes strong language on addressing agricultural commodity derivatives, I would not be surprised to see the U.S. push that in forums such as the G8 and the G20 to ensure that other rich countries that have these future markets will actually do the same. So I have a shred of hope that we will see something, and that news will be coming out within a couple of weeks. We'll know what that bill is going to look like. So I think that's typical that, as you said, we usually see these kind of big changes in a crisis, but you also see them if the big players tend to adopt them at home first and push them on the rest of the world. So I'm hoping for the latter in this instance, so we'll see how that plays out. Yes?
You don't mention the armed conflict or the armed culture contribute to this hunger over all the world. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure I heard.
The armed culture. Yeah.
Yes.
Is a contribution to all these hunger in the world?
Definitely. Conflict is a huge issue which disrupts the movement of food around the world. It also disrupts the ability of agencies such as the World Food Program to deliver assistance. So I definitely see that as a big problem. And it's also a problem where we might see more conflict erupting from the general situation of hunger and economic crisis more broadly. So it's feeding the situation in two different ways. But I agree with you, it's a very important issue.
Is any environmental catastrophe, such as droughts, for instance, or the land reform, we have resources like water, like pesticide. Is it possible that these factors involved on this hunger or poverty for the same reason? Land reform.
That's exactly, it's another huge issue, and especially relevant in certain parts of the world, such as Latin America, where if we saw a more equitable, is this what you're getting at? If we see a more equitable distribution of land, we would see different changes in terms of the way agriculture is practiced, and it might be much more sustainable. I agree with you. Thank you.
First, thank you for a very insightful talk. My question is about the role of business, potentially, in helping solve this problem. You brought to attention the shortcomings and opportunities that world organizations have, as well as governments. In your mind, in your view, do you see any role for businesses to help solve this problem outside a philanthropic perspective?
Outside of a...
Outside philanthropy.
Outside philanthropy, meaning the Gates, right. I mean, that's a good point, because Gates Foundation is one of the huge new players on the aid block, and they're giving a lot of money to look at food security issues. As I'm sure you're aware, the UN is really pushing public-private partnerships in its Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa, which is trying to bring in business as key players in developing local markets within developing countries for food grains. So rather than relying on imports from abroad, working on productivity as well as marketing within developing countries. And I think there is a big role for business to play there. There's also a lot of critique of that approach too, because it's unclear whether that is trying to push an agenda of corporate kind of approaches to biotech versus different kinds of agriculture. But what's interesting is the AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa, which is a public-private partnership involving Gates and other corporations. They've explicitly not taken a stand on agricultural biotechnology, so perhaps that's a signal that we can see a more cooperative solution. But I'll just add one more thing too, is that the ISTAD report, which I discussed, which involved over 400 scientists working on this product of this report, did involve business members who were from the agricultural biotechnology corporations, and they actually withdrew from the process because they didn't like the direction it was going in. So there is still a lot of conflict and debate in the field over the way forward.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much for making such a complex issue so simple for some of us to understand. My question relates to local knowledge. In some of these issues that affect some of the developing countries, the whole idea of local knowledge is not really taken into consideration. You mentioned that the G20 summit put up a 20 billion trust fund, which is going to be housed with the World Bank, the very organization that has wreaked havoc in some of the developing world. My question is, could it have been possible to have this fund housed in a consortium of developing countries to see to it that fund is put to use as is intended?
Thank you for an excellent question. I mean, this is the issue that is so contentious right now, as I tried to allude to, is that the Committee on World Food Security and the FAO, which includes representation from developing countries, includes representation from farmer groups around the world, were completely shut out of the funding process. And they are very upset that the control is now completely in the World Bank. But the reason, I would say, as a political scientist, the reason that the G20 and the G8 chose the World Bank as the place to house its funds is because it has more control over that body than it does over the other body. And it's a big issue, because you're right, issues of local knowledge and understanding of agroecological systems is lost when you take like a modern technology kind of approach as your only approach. And that is the big concern. In fact, Pat Mooney from the Etc. group based in Ottawa, he's been a long-standing follower of global food governance. He was in Rome at the World Food Summit, and he just said, you know, putting the money in the World Bank is like separating the pocketbook from the brain, and he was just beside himself at the situation. So it's troubling, indeed.
Just a quick question. It seems that we're in a green revolution again. You just turn on your television and there's all kinds of commercials about this new green economy that we're entering. And part of that is pushing local, like food localism. Is this a good or bad thing for farmers in the developing world?
For farmers in the developing world. Yeah. Well, there's a big group of farmers that are coordinated through peasant groups such as Via Campesina that are pushing for local food systems around the world, in developing countries as well as in rich industrialized countries. And other movements such as the slow food movement, they're all pushing in the same direction of food sovereignty, in other words, limiting international food trade and building resilient local food systems. And what we're seeing is a lot of, as you said, we're trying to build build a green economy and be more resilient to shocks, this is something where local food systems can actually build resilience. It may not be as efficient as global food trade, but it's more resilient. And that's what we need in a world in which is challenged by climate change, population growth, and other kinds of shocks, such as volcanoes even, has been affecting the food trade. So in those situations, people are saying we do need more locally resilient food systems in rich countries and in poor countries. So I don't see a huge contradiction there.
I think that we have to cut it off there. If you have more questions, maybe Jennifer can stay afterwards and take your questions. I'd just like again to thank Jennifer very much for taking an incredibly complex problem and putting it out on the table for us and not losing all of the, a lot of the detail that's important to really getting our minds around the idea. So please help me thank her. And also, thank you to CG for sponsoring this talk. It's really wonderful that we have this facility to be able to host these kinds of events. So thanks to CG as well.
And thank you, Alison. I'd be happy to answer any individual questions if people have them. Thanks.